My name is Alec Summers. I am MITRE's CVE and CWE project lead, and I am really thrilled about this talk. It's about the Enriched CVE Record, redefining completeness and quality for greater impact. Key takeaways that I have for you for this talk is that CVE data enrichment is evolving. It has been evolving, it is evolving. And that in and of itself is redefining completeness in the ecosystem. There is active community participation, and it's driving sustained improvement and adoption of more information being provided by the ecosystem. And really critical to everything is that complete, accurate, and timely CVE records are critical to reducing cybersecurity risk and a safer global ecosystem. So I don't want to go through tons and tons of history, but I have some here. One of the things is that in 1999, a CVE record consisted of 3 elements. You had the ID, right? We're all familiar with that. You had a brief description, buffer overflow, and Unixware. Xauto program allows local users to gain root privilege. And you had an external reference directing to further relevant information. This still remains as the required elements of a CVE record. And fun fact, you kind of got the sort of sneak ahead look. I didn't have my timing right. They still actually have the same server running with all their 1999 advisories to this day in the original format. So that was CVE record completeness in 1999, 25 years ago. A lot has changed since then. There's vastly more software, vastly more complexity, more connectivity, more detection tools. We have had and seen a proliferation of vulnerabilities, and vulnerability management itself has grown more complicated. In addition to that, since 1999, we've had a lot of other standards evolve and grow and cultivate that have emerged for various purposes in managing vulnerabilities. And I know many in this room can name several. I'm going to talk about a few, but they're useful for different purposes because they help in decision-making. They help in prioritization. They help in managing vulnerabilities in operations as to whether something's relevant to someone or not. They help in terms of understanding how severe a vulnerability may be, depending on the context, right? How bad is it in general? And other characteristics. So historically, in terms of enrichment, one of the things that I mentioned before is a general notion of severity. And what we had developed, I forget the year, I should have reflected on this, but we've had CVSS, and it's gone through several iterations. The idea, I put in quotes there, around a general understanding for a standard around severity of vulnerabilities. We also had CWE, which I'm more familiar with, which came about literally out of the CVE program when we started to see data in the sense of similar things happening, right? Different kinds of similar vulnerabilities being disclosed in certain categories, right? So types of vulnerabilities is really the roots of where CWE became the definition of weaknesses. And then also we had systems for identifying software, naming schemes for software, of which there are several. And there's actually going to be a panel discussion on this, as well as other talks throughout this week that I hope you have time to go to, myself included, touching on the challenge of software identification and the multi-identifier ecosystem that we're all enjoying these days. But also we've got lots of other metadata around vulnerabilities that matter, right? KEVs, package URL, EPSS, a lot of things that bring value to management of vulnerabilities. And how this all worked historically, not everything existed, right, at different times, but we had the CVE database. We had a growing and still growing community of CVE records, CNAs, right, generating CVE records, originally not, but let's say starting in 2016. And you'll note we've got all these CNAs depicted as little houses in bubbles for some reason. And what we started to see was that sometimes when these things came about, CNAs would enrich their records directly into the CVE program. So they would add a CVSS score when they decided within their operations this was important to them. It wasn't required by the CVE program, but they wanted to do it for different number of reasons. They might add CWEs, right? And that was consumed by, well, a variety of folks, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. In addition, historically, we had third parties where NVD, for example, would pull the CVE data in and using public information from advisories and other references and articles and all sorts of things, make determinations for these things as they became valuable and were part of their mission space to say, we're going to add CVSS information to all records. We are going to add CWE information to all records. We're going to add CPE information to all records. So suddenly we had this enriched information coming in as well from another place. And what this really has resulted in now is essentially the definition and manifestation of a new kind of completeness in the record, right? Consumers are now expecting to see CVSS information. They're expecting to see CWE information in a new kind of way. It's important to say, too, that generally speaking, the CVE program has evolved. One of the things that is, I think, why the program has been successful, at least to the degree that it has, and this is still true to this day, is that it is consistently demonstrated an ability to evolve to bring greater value to the security community. One of the things, case in point, I mentioned 2016. Prior to 2016, every single CVE record was written by the MITRE Corporation, sometimes in collaboration with other CNAs. At the time, there was, I'm looking at Chris, 16, 24 CNAs, something like this. But they were all written by the MITRE Corporation. And a centralized model for vulnerability identification naming does not scale. And so the program, through federation and the empowerment of more and more CNAs, really was an experiment to see, can this program scale? Can we grow adoption, grow coverage of the program through federation and empowerment of an ecosystem, a community of CNAs? So I mentioned in the last slide, there's changing expectations now for what a complete record is. There's plenty of concerns on individual records, quality of records overall. But in general, if we talk about quality, a subset of quality being completeness, there is a new demand for that, right? There's an expectation that CVSS is part of a record, CWE is part of a record, and software identity is becoming increasingly part of this. And there's different ways to do that. A little bit about the CVE data format. It's developed by the community. It was mentioned in this room, I forget which talk, but the Quality Working Group, which is a community group that helps to develop and evolve the CVE record format. And over the last 25 years, the CVE program has evolved its record format several times. And really the main thing of it is that it has evolved into a structured format that allows specific data elements now to be added into the record by CNAs at the time of disclosure. So the previous model, like I said, where some information was provided and then it was enriched by others, isn't necessarily how things have to be. So as a result of the evolution in the record format, CNAs are capable and willing, and we're going to talk more about that, to provide this kind of enrichment information, this new level of completeness at the time of disclosure, rather than waiting, right? Rather than waiting on downstream consumers to potentially add it, with less information perhaps, and more, time involved in the process, they can be added from the beginning. By the way, I do have a little reminder to myself. Be sure to attend Chris Coffin and Megazone's talk on the CVE record later this week, past, present, and future. It'll be a good talk. I'm not going into a lot of the history. I just wanted to give a little general level setting. So what we started to see was that this new level of completeness expectation coincided also with community developed tooling for making CVE records. Many of you might be familiar with some of these clients. Many of you might use them. I gave an example, Vulnogram, to drive or to simplify and enable CNAs to provide and publish CVE records quickly and easily in a client. And so that tool also was one of the drivers in what we started to see with more and more CNAs providing this information as part of their records. And in addition to that, in April, actually a few weeks from virtually a year ago, the CVE program kicked off an enrichment initiative where it literally called out as a call to action to the CNA community to say, hey, you can very easily provide this information. And in fact, you are best positioned to do it. You know your products better than anybody else. You have access to all the right data to make the correct determinations for CVS scores and CWEs and other such enrichment information. You are the authoritative source of vulnerability information within your CNA scope. And in addition, last year as well, one of the things that was going on, there was a lull in NVD enrichment. And so there was a demand from consumers and customers, as I said, that have grown accustomed to the idea of a new level of completeness for this information. And one of the things that was true about this announcement and sort of call to action to the community was an idea that really the program federation is continuing, right? And federation means empowering roots and CNAs with agency and responsibility, and calling on them as best positioned and the requisite experts to provide this information to do so. And you can do it in the record. So what we saw is some really exciting information, which is that, and I sort of did this in big chunks of like months at a time. We sort of look at this data in different chunks, and I put a couple things here. There's a little yellow line with a little fancy bolt there. That's really indicating that just prior, so basically, I think it was fall 2022, hopefully I'm right about that, Vulnogram, the client, CVE record generating client that I mentioned, made it easier for, right, CNAs to add enrichment information as part of their record. So we started to see, right, looking at active CNAs that are publishing records within a data set time frame, right, how many were providing every one of their records with a CVSS score? How many were providing every one of their records with a CWE? And both. And then at the bottom is a percentage. And basically what you can see is, yes, it started, right? They were able to do it. I think Chris Madden on my last talk made a great point. Like if you make it easy for people to do the right thing, they will do the right thing. And this is indicative of that. So we see more and more people adding this information over time. You can see in April 2024 last year, this enrichment initiative from the CVE program, calling on CNAs to do more, had a huge surge in that first window, and now we're seeing more and more, and the percentage of active CNAs with records in the data set of these timelines, right, is increasing, which is great, and we want to see more of that. So I was thrilled to share that with you. One of the other things is that to recognize this and to encourage others to adopt a new level of completeness, a new sort of level of transparency and completeness in record production, the CVE program sort of came up with this idea of a recognition list, which started in September. This was basically intended to be criteria driven around what is valuable to the program in terms of completeness and quality. And it was never meant to be a sort of set in stone set of criteria, but it started in September with initial criteria around CVSS and CWE information being provided as a matter of routine. And what we started to see, oh, and just to be clear, so this is criteria for an enrichment recognition list. This was a first step along this process. It's possible and likely that the criteria will change as the CVE program works with its federated community to try and continue to drive changes in completeness, but not just completeness, drive changes in quality too, right? Changes in quality is one step further than complete. And that's also important and may be reflected in criteria for the ERL, and also recognition that the ERL may eventually become sort of more granular in terms of levels, right, or different kinds of organizations doing different kinds of things or different contexts. This is just a graph showing what we've seen in the ERL over time. Just calling attention to you guys, really At the end of the day, yes, it looks a little wonky and wobbly. It's generally going up, right? We have more CNAs over time. We have more CNAs on the ERL. As a percentage, it sort of ranges between the low 70s going up to the upper 70s. But we're seeing more and more active CNAs as well. So a lot of these things come together. But the important point is that we're seeing more and more folks do this. And we're going to keep tracking this and celebrating it. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this. The list of those that are on the enrichment recognition list are published on the CVE website on a biweekly basis. So, and we want to do more probably around that, just showing some trends and sort of other things too. And what's the impact of this? Because I think that's the most important thing as a takeaway, and maybe it's not obvious. So providing enrichment at the time of disclosure really means more accurate and precise information is in the hands of defenders on a more timely basis, right? So as I mentioned, we're not waiting for a record to be enriched by someone else down the line. We're not waiting for that time. And it also strengthens the vulnerability management ecosystem and the entire cybersecurity community in better addressing risks. The value of these vulnerability metadata, these new systems, are valuable for different reasons, for prioritizing, right? Knowing something is actively exploited, right? Or may likely be exploited, right? How severe something is, right? A lot of these new metadata is really valuable for different reasons. And so when it's available for different use cases, it really moves the needle for a lot of folks with different mission spaces. And I did want to just put there at the bottom, I know there's many represented in this room, probably from various CNAs. And if you are doing this, thank you. It's really wonderful that you're doing that. And it's doing a lot to reduce cybersecurity risk. I also have a couple visuals that I thought might be helpful since I have the podium up here to just illustrate how this all works together. The CVE program is a federated hierarchy. It's a rules-based program, and it's a voluntary program. And so when we talk about people being asked to provide more information, right? Being asked to provide enriched information, right? It's asking people to do more, right? And it's asking people to do more for themselves, but also for the community. And that's what's so valuable about all of this. And really the CVE records are so central to so much of what cybersecurity in general is, right? I mean, when we talk about CVE records, we talk about that information being pulled down into national databases and advisories, tool vendors of all different kinds, right? Incident response operations, data scientists, researchers, policymakers. A lot of these folks have feedback and concerns, but and they are all working to advance the program in new kinds of ways of value. And we work with all of them through working groups up right in the top, right? That is what really drives advancement here, in addition to CNA action. So just wanted to throw that in there. And then I did another one that sort of like pulls it down a little bit further, just showing like, yeah, if you look at national vulnerability databases and advisories and tool vendors, all these different kinds of things, CVE records and what's in them is so directly impactful to so much of cybersecurity mission space. So what's next? CVE will continue to encourage and track enrichment activities. We're going to be expanding community-driven quality improvements. There's going to be a lot of different ways to do that. I know many in the community have ideas about that, and we want to hear them and work with you to improve these things. The idea also is that as part of our federation and encouragement and providing agency to Roots, right, is that Roots are responsible for a set of CNAs. And so this information, as far as the CNAs enrichment is concerned, is going to be shared with Roots such that they can create and have conversations with CNAs in their respective purviews and talk about maybe there's challenges in terms of doing different kinds of things in having new levels of complete records or not. So that's something we're working towards. And as I mentioned before, the enrichment recognition list criteria may change over time as we sort of use it as a nice sort of encouraging recognition of those that are doing something that we want to drive the program towards, right, in terms of completeness and quality. And obviously, everything that the CVE and CWE program does is driven by community engagement. We have a tremendous, vast amount of community stakeholders that we want to work with, and we do work with actively in working groups virtually every day of the week. And that's what we want to continue to do. So I have exhausted my slides, and I know this is just after lunch, and people are maybe just recovering from their lunch consumption. But this is the time for questions, and I would love to hear your questions. And I believe the best way to do it is to use a microphone, which, there's a microphone in the middle if you're willing to walk up, because I think there's a virtual audience too that would like to be able to hear your question.
Thanks for the update. That was really cool. What's MITRE with its CNA as last resort hat on? How's it performing against the ERL criteria at the moment?
Not well, Bob. The MITRE CNA-LR has not been typically enriching CVE records, and that is partially to do with the scope of the CNA-LR and the information it's provided. So to answer your question, we are not enriching unless we have trusted, how can I say, information that is very trustworthy and able to be included as part of the record. The CNA-LR is a CNA-LR, excuse me, the CNA is last resort, right? The people that are coming to the CNA-LR very often don't have the information of the product developer, for example. And so as far as completeness goes with the CNA-LR, that's not something that historically it's done. What we're trying to do is find ways to incorporate that into our processes, and also maybe to start requiring it of the researchers that are coming to the CNA-LR to come with that information. And I'll be honest, it's a bit of a balancing act, as you can imagine, because there's also the timeliness nature of wanting to get an ID for a vulnerability out and wanting to get quality information in that ID as well. So.
Thanks.
Alec,
Yeah,
I have a question for you. So you're saying that we've added all this new enriched data to the CVE records. So is there a difference with the information I can get from the NVD site versus the CVE website? What additional data can I get in each place, or different data?
sure. That's a great question, actually, and when we get a lot. Where do I go to pull my data? I will start by clarifying a very common misconception in the community, which is that these are the same thing, or that CVE is NVD, or that NVD makes CVE information, or that MITRE is NVD, or that MITRE is CVE alone. There's a lot of misconceptions around this. So, but more to the detail of your question, enrichment within the CVE record, as I articulated and shown in the I showed in the data, is something that is new, that is being done within the CVE record now, and it was not being done within the CVE record itself going back in history, right? So 1999, 2010, there's a lot of enrichment information that lived in NVD, for example.
And the enriched data is provided by the CNAs, right?
Yes, and now in CVE, enrichment information is provided by CNAs. So for example, in the current data set and going forward from now, every day that we see new records come out, that information is being provided by CNAs into the CVE record, into the CVE list. So a certain amount of historical data, it's important to acknowledge, is in NVD concerning those records, yeah.
You mentioned criteria, the initial criteria.
Mhm.
Have there been any discussions around expanding that, and specifically to what kind of other criteria to
Ye-
enrich records in the future? What would be useful? What do people find useful?
Yeah, so there has been discussions about it, both in deciding what the initial criteria was going to be for that enrichment recognition list, and also that it was not meant to be set and that's it, right? It's meant to be a living set of criteria. So there's been discussions around the idea, actually, to be honest, in some ways around volume. That is to say, if you have 2 records in the data set window, a few months versus 400, should you be held to the same, sort of criteria for this recognition? That's some discussions. There's also discussions around completeness now that we have the capability to support CPE information in the CVE record, right? So that's something where it's like, yeah, maybe as an encouragement for people to provide that information within their records, this is one way to encourage that, right? So CPE, software identity is another one. But you can imagine any number of sort of vulnerability metadata being considered for part of what a complete and quality record might be. And really what the list is meant to be is not a punishing tool of saying you didn't do good enough. It's more striving and recognizing those that are doing certain things that are valuable to the community in terms of the data they're providing.
Alec, so I looked at the list and I think the list is a good idea. You have 250 CNAs on that list. Less than 180 CNAs have published a CVE since you started the list. Is it just like once you're on, you're on?
No, it's actually run every biweekly, and the data set is done within a window.
That window must be pretty huge then, right?
It's within a 4-week window of where your last record was. So we're trying to capture enrichment for those that are, for example, like I just mentioned, Microsoft has a ton of records all the time.
Yeah.
Another CNA may not, but when they publish their record within the data set. So we're looking basically at a year, right? So if we look across a year, let's say somebody has 4 records in that year.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they're spread out, right? So we are looking for completeness based on that criteria within the 4 weeks of their most recent record.
Yeah, but there are CNAs on the list that have zero.
That have not had a record in that data set yet.
Yeah, that are on the list. Do they
No,
just
no, no.
do they just never fall off?
No, there should not be anybody on the list who has not had a record at all. Sorry?
The ERL list, the list of 250 CNAs, right?
I don't know what the number is right now, but
It's
it changes.
250. I looked because I
Okay.
cross-referenced them, and there's only 180 CNAs in the last year that have published a record. So that means there are 70 on the list at a minimum that don't have a CVE published in the last 12 months.
That is a discrepancy that I cannot speak to because that should not be the case.
Yeah, I was wondering because like out of 250 out of the 356 CNAs that are on the list, there's nearly every CNA, especially if you take out of the 81 that was in the last board meetings that haven't published any CVEs.
There's a set of CNAs that, for example, are not active in the sense that they don't have a record published in the data set. But what you're telling me is that there's some on the list. You're asserting that within the list, for
The
example, most
250
recently, there's some on there that did not have a record in the last year. That's what
Yeah, in the last 12 months, because I just went to April 2024 from your slide and just said, how many CNAs are there?
Yeah. I mean, I would be happy to follow up with you on this because we have the data for it. So if there's a problem in terms of what's being listed,
Okay.
I want to follow up
Okay,
and correct it. Yeah.
Would you ever think about shrinking down that list so it's in the last month or whatever? So that award is more of a,
Yeah. To be clear, we are open and I'm speaking, I mean, this is a list criteria that was developed as part of the CVE program as a collective, right? In terms of changing the criteria for the ERL, yes. Like as far as making it a better, more useful list, absolutely. Right. And that could go doing it less often, like checking, and only publishing it every quarter, every month or something, changing the criteria. What is the amount, right? The granularity of how much of CWEs in your records you need to provide. Is there other data you need to provide? All those things are considerations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, so in a lot of our vulnerability analysis, where we use a lot of, say, dependency track, we're seeing an ever increasing, severity unassigned. And I'm just curious if this, that coming maybe primarily from NVD, if it's just purely the backlog, or could also the ERL stuff maybe be factoring into reevaluations or modifications that's then leading to that.
So sorry, just to make sure I understand your question, you're saying that a lot of vulnerabilities you're responding to do not have which data?
It's an unassigned severity.
Unassigned severity. So there's no CVSS scores.
Correct.
Right. Got it. So
But it just seems to be an ever increasing. I mean, and I don't know, maybe it's just purely the backlog is just the ever increasing, or just the lull. And
it depends. There's potentially a lot of context around that. I'm actually curious because I do know that there are CNAs, for example, and participants in the CVE program that are not providing CVSS scores. And in some cases, part of that is because it depends on the context. And I think one of the things that folks have against CVSS, at least in terms of not a complete CVSS score, right? And they're just doing the basics, is that it doesn't take into account context. So they don't want to provide it because if they did, depending on the context, it would be a 10 for everything. I think that might be a case where maybe there's a lot that are not getting that, but I can't speak to it in general. But generally speaking, yes, if it's not being provided by the CNA or a third stream, a third party, which I would think it would be through either the CVE ADP in the program or NVD down the line, then I would think, sorry, you looked like you were going to say something. I was going to say, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's either those two things being added after the fact, if the CNA isn't providing it. Yeah.
So an earlier speaker from another session this morning said that there should be more CNAs and that should include the software manufacturers themselves. An audience member from that session then asked the speaker, basically challenged that and said, wouldn't that create a conflict? I'm just curious your take on that.
We have hundreds of CNAs that are software producers. In fact, software producers know the code better than anybody else and are best positioned to provide enrichment data about their vulnerabilities. Did I understand your question correctly?
Yeah, just
Oh, okay.
comment on it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, we have some virtual questions.
Okay. I know we're, is it okay to go over? Because I think I'm only half hour, but.
Oh, I thought you were till 3:30.
Oh, perfect. Then oh, there's nothing scheduled. Got it. Okay. Yeah. I'm happy
Are you
to
comfortable?
continue answer. Yeah.
Okay,
I got
cool.
water.
Great. Okay, first virtual question. What if DHS gets severe funding cuts under the current administration, leading to the CVE contract at MITRE being canceled?
Yeah, that's not relevant to this conversation at all.
Fair enough.
I'm not sure even how to answer it, but that's not appropriate for the call. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. For CNAs, is there some review performed by MITRE about CVEs assigned to the CNAs as quality of service process?
So just understanding the question, the phrasing was a little weird. So is there a review quality control for CNAs providing records to the program?
I
Does
think that's
does MITRE have a centralized audit, let's say, of CNA data?
I think that's what the question's getting at, yes.
No, the MITRE, like as an entity, MITRE's roles in the program include a number of things: running a top-level route, running the MITRE top-level route CNALR, running the MITRE, running the CVE program secretariat. But part of its roles are not auditing CNA data provided to the CVE program.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's a great point. Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, there are rules for this program. It's a rules-based program. There are CNA operational rules, but I don't know if that's the question that's being asked. I think it was more along the lines of the data itself, if we're auditing the data. And what is controlling the operations of the program, which touches on the quality of the data, perhaps, is the CNA operational rules and other rules around the program in terms of CNA operations, disputes, end of life things, all sorts of stuff.
Okay, great. We have another virtual question. Besides CISA, are other parties in the queue to provide enrichment to CVEs?
So first and foremost, I hope the most important thing from this talk is that CNAs are best positioned to provide enrichment information. So that's the first thing. If they don't provide that information, the CISA ADP called enrichment, a part of its mission is to provide certain certain enrichment information as part of their mission if it's not provided by the CNA. I can't speak for the NVD, but they also do enrichment activities and they have a queue that they work through. At this time, those are the third parties that would provide the information if it's not provided by the CNA.
Okay, and I think those are all the virtual questions.
There's one hand.
All right.
There are, this is virtual again, there are 250 CNAs on the ERL, but less than 180 CNAs have been published CVE since the start of the program, April 2024. If a CNA meets the ERL guidelines one time, are they continually on the list? Would it make sense to limit the list of the CNAs who published in the last 90 days or another published timeframe?
So this is the same question that was asked earlier, which is
Oh, I'm sorry.
fine. It's fine. What I can say is that
No, you're.
if there is a discrepancy in the data set, the point is that folks that are on the ERL maintain their position on the ERL based on their continued action in their records that they are publishing. So it is possible, and I know that this happens, that organizations that are on the ERL drop off the ERL the next time that it's calculated. However, Jerry, I think, asked this question in person. I don't know who put it online, but he did raise a concern because he's saying that there are too many folks on it that shouldn't be. And we follow our process for data analysis very closely. So I'm curious as to whether or not there's a disconnect in terms of interpretation of who should be on the list or not.
Okay, thank you. Last one. Is the ERL algorithm implementation open source?
The ERL algorithm open source. At this time, no, I don't think it is. That's certainly something that we should look into, just so that, you know, if there's any questions or concerns. The calculation of it, though, is described, right? The code itself is not open source at this time, but what is the criteria for getting on it is described on the website.
Perfect, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you so much for your time, Alec.
Thanks, everybody.